The storm erased the road, the trees, and every sense of direction, sealing the night inside a wall of ice and wind. Out of that white silence came a German shepherd, trembling but still moving forward. Behind her, small bodies struggled to keep up, too weak to cry, too cold to stop. No food, no shelter, no one calling them home, only a will strong enough to keep walking. Then headlights cut through the blizzard. A Navy SEAL slowed his truck and made a quiet choice that would change every life there. What happened next would move a town and reveal what real courage looks like when no one is watching. If stories like this give you hope, please subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us share more stories of faith, compassion, and second chances, and maybe the light someone needs in their darkest night. Freezing rain stitched the night together in Portland, Oregon, turning streets into mirrors and the river into a moving sheet of steel under low clouds. Ethan Cole moved through that weather the way he moved through most things now, quietly, efficiently, without asking permission. At 39, he carried the build of a man who had once been shaped by discipline and danger, 6 feet tall, shoulders broad but no longer flexed for show strength, packed inward like a door kept shut. His face was angular, clean-shaven out of habit, with a jaw that looked carved rather than grown. Short dark hair lay flat against his head, already threaded with gray he refused to notice. His eyes, a muted blue, rarely revealed what he was thinking. They had learned long ago that thoughts could be liabilities. He wore a heavy civilian coat that never quite hid the posture of a former Navy SEAL. The war had not broken him loudly. It had taught him to withdraw, to choose tools over conversations, machines over people, solitude over explanations. Since leaving the teams, Ethan fixed marine engines at a small riverside workshop, hands busy, mind guarded. Portland suited him, rainy enough to justify silence, large enough to disappear inside. That night, as Ethan locked the workshop and started toward his truck, the wind shifted. It carried a sound that didn't belong to weather or water, a short, strained exhale, almost a cough. Ethan stopped. The habit of listening had never left him. He turned toward the Riverwalk, boots slipping slightly on the glazed concrete. The sound came again, closer now. Ethan followed it past a darkened bench and a row of bare maples rattling like bones. That was when he saw the dog. The German shepherd stood half in shadow, half in the weak amber spill of a street lamp. He was large, powerfully built, but reduced by cold and hunger. His coat was black and tan, thick but dulled, clumped at the chest with freezing rain. He looked 4 or 5 years old, full-grown, with a squared muzzle dusted pale by ice. One ear stood rigid, the other bore a small tear along the edge, an old injury. Around his neck the fur was worn thin and a hard ringed skin faintly scarred beneath it. The dog did not bark. He did not retreat. He simply watched Ethan with eyes the color of wet earth, steady, assessing, intelligent. There was no plea in them, no submission. If anything, there was urgency sharpened by restraint. Ethan felt something tighten behind his ribs. He had seen that look before, on men crouched in doorways overseas, on faces that didn't waste energy on panic. "Easy," Ethan said quietly, his voice rough from disuse. He crouched, keeping his hands visible. The dog's muscles tensed, but did not coil. Instead, the dog turned his head sharply toward the river, took 2 steps, then looked back at Ethan. The meaning was unmistakable. Follow. Ethan hesitated. He told himself it was cold, that the river was dangerous in this weather, that he had no obligation beyond calling animal control in the morning. Then the dog took another step toward the water, favoring his right foreleg slightly, and the wind cut harder, as if time itself were impatient. Ethan followed. Near the river's edge, half buried in ice-slick reeds, lay a dark backpack tangled in driftwood. The dog stopped beside it and sat, posture, rigid eyes, never leaving Ethan. Ethan reached down, unzipped the bag, and found damp papers sealed in plastic, a cracked phone, and a laminated ID belonging to a young woman named Olivia Grant. The photo showed a pale-skinned girl with auburn hair pulled into a loose ponytail. Freckles scattered across her nose, eyes bright with an unguarded confidence Ethan recognized as fragile only in hindsight. Ethan swallowed. The dog leaned forward, sniffed the bag once, then looked back toward the dark stretch of river as if expecting something to surface. Nothing did. Only water sliding past indifferent. "All right," Ethan murmured more to himself than the dog. "I see you." He stood slowly, shrugging out of his coat to drape it over the dog's shoulders. The shepherd did not resist. He accepted the warmth with stiff dignity, then rose and stepped close enough that his flank brushed Ethan's leg. It was not affection. It was alignment. Ethan knew then that the night had already changed shape. He could leave the bag, call it in return to the narrow life he had mastered. Or he could take responsibility for the line the wind had drawn between him and this animal who refused to ask for help but demanded action. Ethan picked up the backpack. "Let's get you warm," he said, a dry note of humor slipping through the weight in his chest. "Then we'll figure out who you're really looking for." The dog turned once more toward the river, then followed Ethan back toward the lights, his steps careful but determined. Behind them the water kept moving, carrying its secrets downstream, unaware that one of them had just been claimed. Morning arrived in Portland without apology, gray light spreading thinly across the river as freezing rain softened into a relentless drizzle. Ethan Cole did not sleep. He sat on an overturned crate inside his Riverside workshop jacket, still on elbows, resting on his knees, watching the German shepherd occupy the far corner like a sentry assigned to silence. The dog had accepted water but barely touched the food Ethan set down. He lay sphinx-like on the concrete floor, broad chest rising and falling steadily, head lifted, eyes tracking every sound outside the corrugated metal walls. Up close, Ethan could see more of the story written into the dog's body. The shepherd was powerfully built, but lean to the edge of gauntness, ribs faintly visible beneath winter fur. His paws were large and scarred pads cracked from long exposure to cold ground. The muscles along his shoulders were dense and overdeveloped, the kind shaped by repetitive restraint rather than free movement. He carried himself with discipline, not submission, and when he shifted, it was economical, precise. "You're not lost," Ethan said quietly, the words leaving his mouth before he weighed them. The dog's ears flicked. His gaze did not soften. Ethan stood and moved slowly to the workbench, rinsing his hands in the utility sink. The mirror above it caught his reflection stubble, darkening his jaw. Now eyes rimmed with fatigue he recognized from deployments that ended without resolution. He looked like a man waiting for orders that would never come. When Ethan turned back, the dog was standing. He limped faintly on his right foreleg, an old injury stiffened by cold. Without looking at Ethan, he walked toward the workshop door, stopped, then glanced back once. "No," Ethan muttered. "Not yet." The dog ignored him. He sat by the door, posture rigid, tail low, but still eyes fixed on the outside world, as if the river itself were calling roll. That was when Ethan understood the shape of the problem. This dog did not want warmth. He did not want rest. He wanted completion. Ethan grabbed his phone and scrolled through the damp contents of the backpack again. Olivia Grant, 22. No local alerts yet, no missing persons report tied to the name. That absence felt heavier than confirmation. He slipped the phone into his pocket and reached for a spare leash hanging from a nail. "All right, Ethan," said the corner of his mouth twitching with a humor as dry as old habits. "We do this your way." Outside, the rain carried the smell of rust and wet leaves. The dog stepped out first, moving with renewed purpose despite the limp. He led Ethan not back to the exact spot by the river, but parallel to it along a service road Ethan had passed 100 times without noticing. The dog's nose skimmed the ground, following something invisible, tail lifting slightly when the scent grew stronger. They stopped near an abandoned loading area where weeds punched through cracked asphalt. At the edge of the lot sat a white cargo van, its paint dulled by neglect, rear door ajar by a careless inch. The dog froze. His body went taut, hackles lifting just enough to show restraint rather than fear. A low sound vibrated in his chest, more memory than warning. Ethan crouched beside him. "Okay," he whispered. Inside the van the air was stale with old food and damp fabric. There were empty bowls on the floor, a torn blanket, and loops of frayed rope tied to the interior wall. No people. No movement. Just absence that felt deliberate. Ethan exhaled slowly, cataloging details the way he had been trained to do, when instinct flared. The dog stepped closer, then abruptly turned away, retreating 2 paces as if the threshold itself burned. His breathing quickened, eyes darting. Ethan reached out without touching, palm open, steadying the space between them. "Easy," he said again, this time knowing exactly who he was talking to. The dog backed up until his flank brushed Ethan's leg. He leaned there solid and shaking all at once. Ethan felt the contact like a hand placed on his own spine, grounding him. Ethan closed the van door. He didn't need more proof. Whatever had happened here had taught this animal that obedience came at a cost, and that survival meant anticipating harm before it arrived. Back inside the workshop, Ethan set up a makeshift bed with moving blankets and an old foam mat. The dog circled once, twice, then lay down still, facing the door. Only then did Ethan notice how young he actually was beneath the wear no more than 5 eyes, still sharp with potential that hadn't been allowed to rest. Ethan sat again on the crate, rubbing his hands together. He thought of the ID in the backpack of a young woman whose face carried trust like an untested muscle. He thought of the van, the rope, the way the dog had flinched from a door that should have meant shelter. "I don't know your name," Ethan said quietly. "But you picked me." The dog shifted, resting his chin on his paws, eyes closing for half a second before snapping open again. Watchful, waiting. Ethan felt something unfamiliar stir beneath the armor of routine and distance. Responsibility, yes, but also recognition. This wasn't rescue in the clean cinematic sense. This was alignment between 2 beings who understood what it meant to be used and then discarded. Outside, the river kept moving, indifferent as ever. Inside the workshop, Ethan reached for a legal pad and began to write down everything he'd seen. Times, locations, details. The dog watched him, eyes steady as if taking note. Whatever came next would not be simple. But for the first time in years, Ethan did not feel the pull to step away. He felt instead the quiet pressure of being exactly where he was supposed to stand. Rain thinned into a patient mist by afternoon, the kind that soaked without announcing itself, turning Portland's riverfront into a muted sketch of steel and water. Ethan Cole drove with the windows cracked despite the cold. The German Shepherd sat upright in the passenger seat, body angled forward as if motion itself were a task. He tolerated the slow turns, the stoplights, the city noises with a rigid composure that suggested experience rather than fear. When Ethan braked, the dog braced automatically, weight shifting, low eyes flicking to mirrors and shadows. Ethan watched him from the corner of his vision. "You've done this before," he said quietly. The dog did not look back. He didn't need to. They stopped outside a low brick building with a faded blue sign, Harborline Veterinary Care. The clinic smelled like antiseptic and wet fur, a familiar scent that carried both relief and warning. Inside, the waiting room was empty except for a tabby cat asleep in a carrier, orange-striped, round-eyed, when awake, old enough to have learned indifference as a defense. The veterinarian stepped out from behind the counter, already pulling on gloves. Dr. Megan Brooks was in her mid-30s, average height, with a compact, athletic build shaped by long days on her feet. Her brown hair was pulled into a low ponytail streaked with early silver she made no attempt to hide. Freckles dotted her pale skin, and her eyes, clear green, observant, missed very little. She moved with calm efficiency, but there was warmth beneath it, the kind earned by choosing competence over sentiment. "Hey, Megan," said, voice even. "What have we got?" "A shepherd," Ethan replied. "Found him last night. He led me to something complicated." Megan knelt slowly, letting the dog see her hands. The shepherd stood, muscles tight, ears angling back, not in aggression but calculation. Megan paused, respecting the line. "That's all right," she murmured. "We'll go at your pace." Ethan felt a flicker of gratitude. He hadn't realized how much he needed someone who understood pacing until that moment. The exam took time. Megan noted the worn fur around the dog's neck, the healed scars, the slight limp. She spoke as she worked, narrating without dramatics. "Old restraint injury," she said softly, running practiced fingers along the shepherd's shoulder. "Repeated pressure. Not recent, but not ancient either." She checked gums, joints, eyes. The dog tolerated it with stiff patience, flinching only once when Megan adjusted the collarless fur at his throat. "That reaction," Megan added, straightening, "isn't pain. It's memory." Ethan nodded. He understood the difference. Megan met his gaze. "He's about 5. Strong heart. Underweight, but not past recovery. Whoever had him knew enough to keep him functional. Not enough to keep him safe." The shepherd shifted closer to Ethan's leg, leaning just enough to feel solid. Ethan rested his hand on the dog's shoulder, slow and deliberate. The fur was coarse with neglect, but warm. Alive. "What about a name?" Megan asked lightly, cleaning her hands. Ethan hesitated. Names were promises. He'd learned that the hard way. He looked down at the dog, at the steadiness in his posture, the refusal to beg, the insistence on direction. "Ranger," he said finally, almost under his breath. The dog's ears twitched. He didn't react beyond that, but something in the room shifted acknowledgement, perhaps. Megan smiled once, brief and approving. After paperwork and a careful planned nutrition rest, a follow-up. Ethan loaded Ranger back into the truck. The mist had thickened again, wrapping the city in a quiet that felt earned. Ranger settled more easily this time, head turning to track the road, eyes half-lidded but alert. Ethan didn't go back to the workshop. He drove east, away from the river, toward a small cabin he'd bought years ago in the wooded hills above town. He'd meant it to be a retreat, a place where silence could be controlled. The cabin smelled of pine and old smoke. Ethan lit the stove-set blankets at a careful distance and poured water into a bowl. Ranger waited, watching Ethan's hands. Only after Ethan stepped back did Ranger drink, measured and quiet. As night gathered, headlights cut briefly through the trees outside. Ranger rose instantly, body aligning between Ethan and the door, hackles lifting a fraction. Not attack, barrier. Ethan felt the reflex rise in him, too old and familiar, and for the first time it didn't feel lonely. "Easy," Ethan said, matching Ranger's stillness. The lights passed. The woods returned to themselves. Ranger sat, but did not lie down, keeping watch. Ethan sat across from him on the floor, back against the wall, the stove ticking softly behind him. He thought of Olivia Grant's idea of the van of a dog who had chosen him not for rescue, but for resolve. "You don't quit," Ethan said quietly. "Neither do I." Ranger finally lay down, stretching out with a long exhale, eyes still open. Outside, rain tapped gently at the windows, as if counting time. Inside, 2 sentries kept watch over a future neither had planned, but both had accepted. Night settled early in the hills above Portland, the cabin wrapped in a cold quiet, broken only by the stove's steady breath and the wind threading through fir trees. Ethan Cole was repairing a split strap on an old duffel when Ranger rose without sound. The German shepherd moved from rest to readiness in one smooth motion, body angling toward the door, ears forward, tail still. It wasn't panic. It was recognition. Ethan followed Ranger's gaze to the window. Headlights crept between the trees, slow and deliberate, then stopped short of the clearing. An engine idled. Ethan stood, posture changing the way it always had when a situation shifted from neutral to unknown. He didn't reach for a weapon. He reached for awareness. He placed one hand lightly against Ranger's shoulder, grounding rather than restraining. "Stay," he said quietly. Ranger stayed, but leaned into the word like a promise he intended to keep. The knock came after a pause, firm but not aggressive. Ethan opened the door part way. Cold air spilled in, carrying the smell of damp earth and something sharper beneath it. The man on the porch looked to be in his mid-40s, average height, shoulders slightly rounded, as if apologizing to gravity. His hair was sandy blonde, thinning at the temples, combed carefully to hide it. Stubble shadowed his jaw unevenly, and his pale skin had the washed-out look of someone who spent more time indoors than he admitted. His eyes were light hazel and restless, darting just a beat too quickly from Ethan's face to the interior behind him. "Name's Derek Walsh," the man said, offering a tight smile. His voice was smooth in the practiced way of someone who relied on words to manage outcomes. "I've been looking for my dog." Ethan did not move aside. "You'll have to be more specific." Derek's gaze slid past Ethan again. Ranger stepped forward into the line of sight, silent but unmistakable. The reaction was immediate. Derek's breath hitched, barely visible, but Ranger saw it, the dog's stiffened lips tightening, a low vibration beginning deep in his chest, not a growl but the memory of one. "There you are," Derek said too brightly. "Boy gave me a scare running off like that. Storms do it to animals. You know?" Ranger stepped closer to Ethan, placing his body squarely between the man and the doorway. His eyes locked on Derek's face, unblinking. Ethan felt the clarity settle in. "This dog is under veterinary care," he said evenly. "You don't get to collect him off a porch." Derek lifted his hands, palms out. "Hey, no trouble. I just want what's mine." His smile twitched, then reset. "He's sensitive. Needs someone who knows him." Ranger's hackles rose a fraction. The smell on Derek's stale alcohol masked with cheap mint grew stronger as the man shifted his weight. Ethan caught the detail without effort. "Leave," Ethan said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. For a moment, Derek seemed to consider pushing. His eyes flicked to the trees, to the dark around the cabin. Then his shoulders sagged into a different posture, one that tried on regret. "Didn't mean any harm," he muttered. "Just figured I'd check." He stepped back into the night headlights, flaring as he turned the truck around. Gravel crunched. The engine faded. Ethan closed the door and locked it. He leaned back against the wood for a second longer than necessary, feeling the grain under his palms. Ranger remained standing, muscles tight, ears tracking the distance long after the sound was gone. "That wasn't coincidence," Ethan said quietly. Ranger exhaled slow and controlled, then finally stepped away from the door. He walked to the center of the room, turned once, and sat still, facing outward. "Guarding." Ethan retrieved the legal pad he'd started and added a new entry. Time, description, vehicle, smell, Ranger's reaction. He wrote without embellishment. Truth didn't need it. Later, when the fire burned lower and the woods returned to their neutral chorus, Ranger lay down near Ethan's boots, not touching, close enough. His breathing evened, but one ear stayed tuned to the night. Ethan looked down at him, at the scars, the discipline, the refusal to submit to the wrong voice. He thought of men like Derek, how some people mistook ownership for authority, obedience for loyalty. "You knew he'd come," Ethan said softly. Ranger didn't open his eyes, but his tail thumped once against the floor, deliberate and final. Outside, the wind pressed against the cabin and moved on. Inside, lines had been drawn, the kind that didn't shout, didn't threaten, only held. Morning came quietly to the hills, not as a declaration, but as permission. Pale sunlight sliding through the fir branches and settling on the cabin like a hand meant to steady rather than wake. Ethan Cole stood on the porch with a mug gone lukewarm, watching Ranger move across the clearing. The German shepherd's gait was surer now, the old limp softened by rest and care, his black and tan coat beginning to regain its depth. At 5 years old, Ranger carried himself like a working animal, relearning what peace required, head high, eyes alert, but no longer braced for the first blow. When he paused, it wasn't to listen for danger. It was to listen for Ethan. The sound of tires approached slowly on the gravel road. Ranger noticed first turning posture, attentive but calm. Ethan didn't tense. He recognized the rhythm of an official arrival that didn't come to take, only to check. The woman who stepped out of the county SUV introduced herself as Sarah Whitman, an animal control officer in her early 40s. She was tall and spare movements, economical, her dark blonde hair pulled into a practical bun, already loosening at the edges. Her skin held the weathered look of someone who spent her days outdoors by choice, and her gray eyes carried a steadiness that came from years of seeing the worst without letting it define her. "I'm here about the shepherd," Sarah said, voice-level clipboard tucked against her side. "We received a report." Ethan nodded and stepped aside. "You'll want to see how he lives now." Inside, Ranger stood between Ethan and Sarah without blocking, simply present. Sarah noticed immediately. She crouched, keeping her hands visible, reading the room the way good professionals did. "That's a good sign," she said quietly. "Protective but not reactive." She took notes as she examined Ranger's setup, the bedding placed away from the stove, the measured feeding schedule pinned to the wall, the veterinary paperwork neatly organized. She asked questions not to test Ethan but to understand him. "You're former military," she said after a moment, not as accusation, just recognition. Ethan gave a small nod. "I know what structure does for things that have been through chaos." Sarah looked at Ranger again, then at Ethan. "So do I," she said. "And I know when an animal chooses someone. That matters." Outside, Ranger paced the edge of the porch, then returned to sit at Ethan's feet, his body language open tail resting loose against the wood. Sarah smiled faintly. "There will be paperwork," she said, "and a waiting period. But given the circumstances, I'm recommending long-term foster with intent to adopt." Ethan felt the weight land, not heavy but real. Responsibility had a shape now, and it fit. Later that afternoon, Ethan drove Ranger into town for a follow-up at the clinic. Dr. Megan Brooks greeted them with a familiar nod, relief softening her usually brisk expression when she saw how Ranger moved. "You did good," she said to Ethan, then to Ranger. "Both of you." On the way back, Ethan stopped by the Riverwalk where it had begun. The water was calmer now, sunlight breaking across it in fractured gold. Ethan stood with Ranger at his side and thought of Olivia Grant, of unanswered questions still moving downstream. Some things would take time. Some truths surfaced slowly. But the path forward no longer felt empty. That night the cabin held a different quiet. Not the tight silence of vigilance, but the settled kind that allows breath to deepen. Ranger lay stretched near the hearth, fully on his side for the first time, paws twitching faintly in sleep. Ethan sat nearby, back against the wall, boots off hands, relaxed. He thought of the years he had spent bracing for the next command, the next loss, the next thing to endure. He hadn't expected joy to arrive without ceremony, without fanfare. He hadn't expected it to come on four legs, scarred and watchful, choosing him without words. Ranger stirred, opened one eye, then rose and crossed the room. He rested his head briefly against Ethan's knee, just long enough to be felt, then settled again, closer this time. Ethan laughed softly, the sound surprising him. "Yeah," he said under his breath, "I get it." Outside, the wind moved through the trees and kept going. Inside, the line between duty and belonging thinned, not erased, but honored. Ethan reached out and rested his hand on Ranger's shoulder, steady and warm. The night did not demand anything else from them. It simply stayed. Some people think miracles arrive with thunder, with blinding light, sudden wealth, or voices from the sky. But more often God sends them quietly. A dog who refuses to give up. A man who chooses to stop instead of passing by. A warm place offered at the exact moment the cold feels unbearable. In everyday life, our storms may not be made of snow or darkness. They come as loneliness, loss, exhaustion, unpaid bills, or the quiet fear that no one truly sees us. Yet the same truth remains: God does not waste pain. He places help on our path in forms we might not expect, and He teaches hearts to soften without breaking. If this story reminded you that you are not meant to carry everything alone, please share it with someone who may need warmth today. Leave a comment and tell us which moment touched your heart most, or where you are watching from. Your words may become a light for someone else's long night. And if you believe in stories of hope, courage, and second chances, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and stay with us. May God bless you, protect you, and guide your steps through every season of life. Amen.